On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln became the 16th President of the United States. 44 days after the election, South Carolina seceded from the Union of the States on December 20th. This action brought into question whether the existing forts in South Carolina would be state or federal property. As a precaution, Major Robert Anderson of the Union Army abandoned Fort Moultrie on the shores of Charleston and took up a defense of Fort Sumter. The Union attempted to resupply Fort Sumter on January 9, 1861 with the ship Star of the West, but was fired upon by the cadets at the Citadel and returned unsuccessful. This prompted Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas to secede within the following 3 weeks, and the Confederate States of America was formed. South Carolina repeatedly called for Fort Sumter to be evacuated, and Jefferson Davis sent delegates to Washington to offer to pay for the federal property on Southern lands, pay for the southern part of the national debt, and negotiate a peaceful end. President Lincoln, though, was not willing to accept this because he was determined to not recognize secession as legal or that the Confederate States of America was a legitimate government. Throughout the war, he viewed them as rebellious insurgents, but never as a foreign country. Lincoln claimed that there was no right to secession, even though America was founded on a secessionist document known as the Declaration of Independence. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson authored resolutions for Kentucky and Virginia in 1798 that clearly support the founding philosophy of state sovereignty over the federal government. So, more than being a slavery issue, which Lincoln himself said he had no desire to abolish in his first inaugural address, when he said, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." For Lincoln, it was more important that the Union stay intact. And if he had to start a war to enforce that belief, by God, he was going to do it. Lincoln knew all along that the people of the states have the right of secession. He himself stated on January 12, 1848, while criticizing President Polk over the way he was orchestrating the Mexican War, "Any people anywhere being inclined and having the power have the right to rise up and shake off the existing government and form a new one that suits them better. This is a most valuable, a most sacred right, a right which we hope and believe is to liberate the world. Nor is this right confined to cases in which the whole people of an existing government may choose to exercise it. Any portion of such people that can may revolutionize and make their own of so much of the territory as they inhabit." Lincoln knew that he could not gain the Northern Americans' public support for a war with the South if the North appeared as the aggressor. On March 4, 1861, President Lincoln delivered his inauguration speech and claimed that the North would not invade the South without provocation. In doing this, there needs to be no bloodshed or violence, and there shall be none, unless it be forced upon the national authority. In other words, if you jeopardize my ideal of a centralized, federalized power, then there's definitely going to be bloodshed and violence. The power confided to me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government and to collect the duties and imposts. See, Lincoln didn't want to lose federal power or the extortion monies provided by taxation. But beyond what may be necessary for these objects, there will be no invasion, no using of force against or among the people anywhere, where hostility to the United States in any interior locality shall be so great and so universal as to prevent competent resident citizens from holding the federal offices. There will be no attempt to force obnoxious strangers among the people for that object. Lincoln needed that provocation to come from the South at all costs so that the Confederacy would be blamed for a war. The false flag of Fort Sumter was set in motion. On April 4th, Lincoln ordered a resupply expedition led by Gustavus V. Fox to be sent to Fort Sumter. Then Lincoln notified the Southern Governor Pickens to, quote, expect an attempt will be made to supply Fort Sumter with provisions only, and that if such attempt be not resisted, no effort to throw in men, arms, or ammunition will be made without further notice, or in case of an attack upon the fort. Southern Governor Pickens and General Beauregard made repeated demands to the Union's Major Anderson to surrender and abandon the fort before the supply arrived, which he continued to refuse. The final demand came on April 11th, to which Anderson replied he would leave the fort by noon on April 15th unless he received orders from Lincoln or was resupplied. General Beauregard felt this response to be too conditional and unacceptable. They gave the fort a 1-hour notice and then began shelling, signaling the open shots of the Civil War. Confederate forces shelled Fort Sumter for 3.5 days before Northern Commander Major Robert Anderson surrendered. No one died on either side during the attack. Lincoln wrote this letter 2 weeks later. To Gustavus V. Fox, Captain G. V. Fox, Washington, D.C. My dear sir, May 1st, 1861. I sincerely regret that the failure of the late attempt to provision Fort Sumter should be the source of any annoyance to you. The practicability of your plan was not, in fact, brought to a test. By reason of a gale well known in advance to be possible and not improbable, the tugs, an essential part of the plan, never reached the ground, while by an accident, for which you were in no wise responsible, and possibly I, to some extent, was, you were deprived of a war vessel with her men, which you deemed of great importance to the enterprise. I most cheerfully and truly declare that the failure of the undertaking has not lowered you a particle, while the qualities you developed in the effort have greatly heightened you in my estimation. For a daring and dangerous enterprise of a similar character, you would today be the man of all my acquaintances whom I would select. You and I both anticipated that the cause of the country would be advanced by making the attempt to provision Fort Sumter, even if it should fail. And it is no small consolation now to feel that our anticipation was justified by the result. Very truly, your friend, A. Lincoln. This letter shows intent to draw the South into the war and appear to have the moral high ground with the Northern Americans who were at the time opposed to the idea of war with the South. The plan worked well, and the North was outraged by the bombardment of Fort Sumter. As you know, a long, bloody civil war followed. The South tried repeatedly through peaceful means to get federal forces to leave their state. They didn't want to be controlled by Lincoln's federalized henchmen. Lincoln used the false flag of provisioning a centralized force in a state with people who didn't want him there. And that was his pretext to draw them into war. Even a few Northern papers noted this deception. The Buffalo Daily Courier wrote on April 16, 1861 that, quote, the affair at Fort Sumter has been planned as a means by which the war feeling at the North should be intensified. The Jersey City American Standard said, this unarmed vessel was a mere decoy to draw the first fire from the people of the South, which act by the predetermination of the government is to be the pretext for letting loose the horrors of war. They understood what Lincoln did. Another big misconception is that Lincoln freed the slaves and made slavery illegal. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed the slaves in the areas that were in rebellion as a military move, and the 13th Amendment made slavery legal for the federal government if a crime is committed. Lincoln made several racist quotes throughout his life, maintaining that whites were superior to blacks, and he was also in favor of exporting the freed slaves to anywhere but America. He said, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. I'm not condoning slavery or its institution on any level. It's just important to get the factual perspective of history correct so we don't repeat the same mistakes or think that tyrannical subversions of the Bill of Rights is ever justified. Lincoln is beloved by many in the world to this day. His presidency is another great example of the cult of personality and of history being written by the winners. Even though the large majority of Americans, North and South, believed in the right of secession as of 1861, upon taking office, Lincoln implemented a series of unconstitutional acts, including launching an invasion of the South without consulting Congress as required by law, declaring martial law, blockading Southern ports, suspending the writ of habeas corpus for the duration of his administration, imprisoning without trial thousands of Northern citizens, arresting and imprisoning newspaper publishers who were critical of him, censoring all telegraph communications, nationalizing the railroads, creating several new states without the consent of the citizens of those states, ordering federal troops to interfere with elections in the North by intimidating Democratic voters, deporting a member of Congress, Clement L. Vallandigham of Ohio, for criticizing the administration's income tax proposal at a Democratic Party rally, confiscating private property, confiscating firearms in violation of the Second Amendment, and effectively gutting the Ninth and 10th Amendments to the Constitution, among other things. After the war broke out, Lincoln called a special session in Congress to explain his actions, including suspending habeas corpus. When he wrote this speech in reference to habeas corpus, he wrote that, quote, "More rogues than honest men, practically more of the guilty than the innocent, find shelter under it." For the final speech, he revised it to say, quote, "Some single law made in such extreme tenderness of citizens' liberty that practically it relieves more of the guilty than the innocent should to a very limited extent be violated." Supreme Court Justice Robert B. Taney wrote an opinion that Lincoln didn't have the authority to suspend habeas corpus, and then Lincoln signed a warrant for his arrest, just like any tyrant would. Lincoln also illegally instituted the first income tax to fund the war. It was later repealed because it was and still is unconstitutional to collect income tax from individuals. Lincoln was also the first to use the military draft, which caused a bloody riot in New York in 1863. The draft is something we've all been led to believe is a patriotic servitude to the state, when it stands in complete contradiction to one of our very grievances against King George in the Declaration of Independence. Part of that reads, "He has constrained or conscripted our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands." Lincoln, by his words and actions, was clearly a tyrant set on establishing a federalized power. It's also argued that slavery could have ended much sooner had the southern states been left alone to secede. Under secession, if a slave escaped from a southern state, he could have been granted freedom when he went to another state. Under Lincoln's federal governance, there would be nowhere to escape, since every state would be under one federal law. Lincoln even admitted as much during his first inaugural address, saying, "No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping to another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such labor or service may be due." There's no doubt that Lincoln served to solidify a centralized, authoritarian, overbearing government that we have today, and people idolize him for it. Leave your thoughts about this for the world, the Google Thought Police, and every authoritarian psychopath.